The cap did not fit. Dorothy Fairweather stood before the small clouded mirror in the scullery passage and pressed the linen cap down over her dark hair a second time, tucking the last curling wisp beneath the brim with the flat of her thumb. The glass gave back a stranger. A girl in a plain gray-brown dress, a white apron tied tight at the waist, hands that looked too fine for the work they were pretending to perform. She smoothed the apron. The stranger smoothed hers. It was 5:30 on a Wednesday morning in early March, and the moors above Chalcott House were still hard with winter. The kitchen fire had been lit an hour ago by the scullery girl, a pale child of 12 named Bessie, who had looked at Dorothy without recognition and said nothing at all. That had been the first small mercy. The second had been the cap itself, which Mrs. Price had produced from the back of the linen press with the calm efficiency of a woman who had spent 40 years managing this house and who had learned to solve problems before they announced themselves. "You will need to keep your eyes down," Mrs. Price had said, fitting the cap with both hands as though dressing a child. Not from timidity, from practice. A servant's attention moves to tasks. If you look at faces the way you usually look at them, someone will notice. Dorothy had said she understood. She was not entirely certain she did, but she understood enough. Chalcott House had belonged to her father for 31 years. It had belonged to his father before him, and to his father's father before that. And the stone of it, the gray Derbyshire limestone and the long windows with their uneven panes and the kitchen passage with its flags worn smooth by 2 centuries of feet, had always seemed to her less like a possession than like a body, something she was part of, rather than something she owned. In November, 6 months past, her father had died of a fever that took him in a week, and Chalcott had become hers, and she had not yet finished learning what that meant before the things inside it began to disappear. Not all at once, not obviously. First, the smaller pieces of silver from the sideboard in the dining room. A cream jug first, then a set of apostle spoons, then a handled cup that had been her mother's, then pages from the estate accounts, which she noticed only because her father had kept the books himself, and she knew his hand, as well as her own. Then 2 bundled letters from the solicitor's correspondence chest, missing from their place when she went looking for the record of a particular field lease. Each time she had raised the matter with Mr. Pemberton, the solicitor her father had employed for 15 years, he had been patient with her. Patient in the particular way that men are patient with women who are asking inconvenient questions, the patience of someone who does not intend to answer. She heard him say it to Cornelius Trent in the morning room on the 2nd of January, when she had passed the door on her way to the stairs and the latch had not caught. She had not meant to eavesdrop. She had simply stopped. "The girl has ideas above her station," Pemberton had said, his voice even and almost kind. "She has always had them. Her father indulged it. These things pass when the practical weight of the situation makes itself felt." Cornelius had laughed. Dorothy had gone upstairs. She had sat on the bed in her father's room, which she had not yet changed back to a guest room because she could not quite bear to, and she had looked at her own hands for a long moment. Then she had gone to the study and moved the small painted chest that sat against the far wall and felt along the seam of the floorboard until she found the loose brick her father had shown her when she was 9 years old. Behind it was the household ledger he had kept since 1798, in his own small, precise notations, every item of value in the house catalogued and dated and described. It was the only copy. Pemberton would not know it existed. That was the only advantage she had. If you have ever felt the weight of a house press in on you from all sides and discovered that the very walls have chosen another's authority over yours, then you understand what Dorothy carried with her into that servant's passage on a Wednesday morning in March. Stay with the story. The first move is hers. Mrs. Price appeared at the kitchen passage door with a cup of tea, offered without sentiment, and Dorothy drank it standing at the work table while the fire settled into its working heat behind her. The household was beginning to stir. She heard footsteps on the back stair, the particular creak of the third step, which she had known since childhood. She set down the cup. She had 6 things to learn before the week was out. She needed to know which items Pemberton had already removed and which he was planning to remove. She needed to know who among the servants had been present, who had been asked to carry things, who had been paid to be absent. She needed the name of the carter who had taken the silver from the back lane, and she needed someone who had seen Pemberton's face when he gave the order. The footman's name was Thomas Whitmore, 19 years old, with a gap between his front teeth and a tendency to pull at his cuffs when he was nervous. Dorothy had employed him herself in December, 3 weeks after her father died, because Mrs. Price had said he was honest. She intended to find out if Mrs. Price had been right. She picked up a coal scuttle and went to learn what she could. Chalcott's kitchen passage ran the full length of the east wing and connected the scullery to the stone-flagged yard through a heavy oak door with a broken latch that had been broken since 1807 and had never been repaired because the household had always known to lift and push at the same time. Dorothy had been lifting and pushing that door since she was 4 years old. She lifted and pushed it now, stepped into the gray morning, and nearly walked into a man. He caught the coal scuttle before it hit the ground. His reflexes were very fast for a man of his size and stillness, and he had the scuttle upright and in her hands again before she had fully registered what had happened. She looked up. He looked down. His eyes were gray with a pronounced downward line at the outer corners, and they were doing what eyes do when they are in the process of noticing something more complicated than they had expected to find. "Forgive me," he said. His voice was low and even. "My horse threw a shoe on the lane. I was told to come to the servants' entrance." He was the Marquis of Ashbourne. She knew his name because Cornelius had mentioned him at dinner a week ago, in the particular tone Cornelius used when he was pleased with himself about something. The name had stayed in her memory because it was attached to the neighboring estate, and because Cornelius had said he was expected to view the Chalcott fields with an eye toward purchase, which meant Cornelius had already decided to sell what he did not yet own. She was wearing a servant's dress and holding a coal scuttle and standing in a yard covered in early March slush. He was in a fitted dark navy tailcoat with a white cravat perfectly tied, despite the hour and the ruined road, and he was looking at her with gray eyes that gave nothing away. "I will let Mrs. Price know, sir," she said, keeping her gaze at the level of the second button of his coat. He said nothing for a moment. She could feel him continuing to notice. "Thank you," he said at last. She went back inside. She set the coal scuttle down inside the kitchen door and stood with her back against the stone wall for 3 full breaths before she was certain her face had returned to its usual arrangement. Mrs. Price, when told, received the intelligence about the Marquis's arrival with the equanimity of a woman who had long since stopped being surprised by anything. She sent a boy to the stables and went to rouse the morning room fire herself. Ashbourne was installed in the morning room with tea and a newspaper before the household had properly decided it was awake. Dorothy kept to the passage. It was in the passage, 40 minutes later, that she found Thomas Whitmore alone. He was filling a coal bucket with the methodical unhappiness of someone carrying a private weight, and when Dorothy set her own bucket down and turned to him quietly and said, in the even voice she had practiced since January, "I should like to know what was taken from the silver cupboard, and when, and who carried it?" He stopped filling the bucket and looked at her with the gap-toothed expression of a man who has been waiting for someone to ask him exactly that question for approximately 2 months. He talked for 11 minutes. Dorothy listened with her back to the passage wall and her hands still at her apron strings, remembering every word. Thomas was precise when he was not frightened, and someone had apparently convinced him he was no longer frightened, which meant that someone had taken pains with him since morning in a way that had nothing to do with her. She filed that thought alongside the others. She did not know that Ashbourne had arrived via the passage from the morning room 3 minutes before she finished and had stood at the turn in the corridor with his back against the wall, saying nothing, listening as she listened. She did not know he had watched her face in the half-light, the plain cap and the gray dress and the unhurried patience with which she received everything Thomas told her, the way she did not once write anything down, because she was the sort of person who does not need to. She did not know what he had understood. She would understand it later. Their formal introduction happened at 11 o'clock. When Mrs. Price brought her to the morning room in the cream wool day dress she had changed into after her kitchen work was finished, and introduced her as Miss Dorothy Fairweather, the estate's owner, and Ashbourne stood and bowed with a gravity that contained no trace whatsoever of the yard and the coal scuttle and the 5 o'clock slush. He said he was grateful for her hospitality. She said he was welcome to Chalcot. They said nothing else of substance. She had the impression, watching his face, that the morning room version of this meeting was happening at some remove from a more accurate version that was conducting itself slightly below the surface, and that he was content for the distance to exist until it did not need to. Cornelius, who was present for the introduction, and who had no idea what had happened in the passage, said something about the delightfulness of the estate in spring, and asked whether Ashbourne had had the opportunity to walk the southern fields. Ashbourne said he had not yet. Cornelius said he would arrange it for the afternoon. Ashbourne said that would be agreeable. Dorothy watched them and thought about the bundle of missing account pages and the field lease and the question of whether the southern fields were being offered for admiration or for sale. For now she had a name. The carter's name was Daw, and he operated from the coaching inn at Darley Ford. And she had a date, the 14th of February, when 4 pieces of silver had gone out wrapped in Hessian cloth on Pemberton's instruction. She had Thomas Whitmore's word, which was the word of a 19-year-old footman with a gap between his front teeth. But it was something. It was a beginning. Cornelius Trent had arranged a dinner party for Friday evening, which was the sort of efficiency that Dorothy recognized as a military maneuver rather than a social gesture. 7 guests from the neighboring families, among them Lady Cecily Mallow and her mother, and Ashbourne, who had been persuaded to stay 2 nights at Chalcot, rather than make the return journey to his own estate and back in the mud. The arrangement had been made between Cornelius and Ashbourne's steward. Dorothy had been informed of it, as though she were staff. She had said nothing. She had noted the name, Lady Cecily Mallow, which she had not heard before, and the particular way Cornelius's mouth formed around it. Not the way one announces a guest, but the way one announces a solution. Dorothy appeared at dinner in the cream Empire waist-gown, with the green velvet ribbon at the bodice. Her best, which was still several degrees plainer than any other woman at the table. She had arranged her dark auburn hair herself, and the wisp that always escaped at the left temple had escaped again. She sat between Mrs. Calder from Haddon Farm and a younger Trent cousin whose name she could not remember, and she watched the room the way she had spent 3 days learning to watch rooms. Ashbourne was at the far end of the table. He had changed from the riding dress to a dark coat and a fresh cravat, and his gray eyes moved around the room with the same quality of careful attention she had noticed in the yard that morning. The look of a man in the habit of seeing more than he says. He had not indicated by word or glance that he had ever seen her before. She was grateful for it in a way she found difficult to name. Lady Cecily Mallow was at his right hand. She was fair and polished, in ice-blue silk that caught the candlelight as though it had been chosen for exactly this room and exactly this light, and she spoke with the fluent ease of a woman who had been trained for rooms like this since birth and found them native. She was not unkind. That was what made her presence feel so much like the closing of a door. Cornelius proposed a toast to the estate, which was the kind of toast that meant something more than it said. Then he turned to Dorothy at the far end of the table, past 7 intervening guests and their candlesticks, and said with the confident warmth of a man performing generosity, "We are all grateful, of course, for my cousin Dorothy's stewardship of her father's house during this difficult period, though I think we can agree that the management of an estate of this complexity requires, shall we say, a steadier hand than perhaps she can yet provide." Laughter would have been worse. There was no laughter. There was something slightly more terrible, which was the polite stillness of 7 people deciding not to respond. "A girl with ideas above her station is a pretty thing in a daughter," Cornelius continued, reaching for his glass with the ease of a man who has said what he means so often in so many rooms that he no longer notices the rooms, but a costly one in an air. Dorothy set her fork down with the particular care of someone who is holding more than flatware. She did not look at Ashbourne. She felt, rather than saw, the quality of his attention shift. The dinner continued. The courses came and went. Lady Cecily said something graceful about the Derbyshire countryside, and Ashbourne replied briefly, and Dorothy watched a serving girl move along the sideboard and thought about the 14th of February and a carter named Daw and 4 pieces of silver wrapped in Hessian cloth. She would think about the dinner later. She would think about the look on Cornelius's face when he said what he said, confident and almost fond. The look of a man who believes the argument has already been won. She would think about the candles and the way the room had arranged itself like a verdict. She would think about Lady Cecily in ice blue silk, who had not joined in, who had in fact very slightly looked away. But at the dinner itself, sitting in the cream gown with the wisp at her left temple, Dorothy had been very still and had continued to eat her dinner, because she was the sort of person who finishes what she begins. He came to the library that evening after the guests had separated. She did not hear him enter. She was sitting at the reading table with the household ledger open before her, her father's notations spread under the light of 2 candles, and she was so thoroughly inside the work that the sound of the door registered only as a change in the air against her neck. When she looked up, Ashbourne was standing just inside the doorway with his hands behind his back, and he was not surprised to find her there. He came to the table. He looked at the ledger. He did not ask permission to sit. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down and looked at the pages she had open. And his face was the face she had been watching all evening. That particular gray-eyed consideration that gave nothing away and missed nothing. "That is your father's hand," he said. "Yes. It is a complete inventory of everything in this house as of the 1st of October last year," she said. "My father updated it quarterly. He was meticulous." He was quiet for a moment, reading the page. "And the discrepancies between this record and the current contents of the house are what you have been cataloging." It was not a question. She looked at him. "I was in the passage this morning," he said. "I should have made myself known. I did not." She held herself very still. "Why not?" He was quiet again. Not evasive. Something more considered. His left hand rested on the edge of the table, and she was aware of it in the way one becomes aware of specific objects in a room when the rest of the room has gone a little too quiet. "When I was 29 years old," he said, "my wife told me she was afraid. She told me the pregnancy had progressed badly, and she had fears for the outcome. I listened to what the physician said rather than to what she said, because the physician was reasonable and she was frightened, and I believed at the time that reasonable was a better guide than frightened." He paused. The candles gave a small movement. She died in September of 1812, and the child with her. Dorothy did not move. She was aware of her own heartbeat as a physical fact, the specific weight of it in her chest. "I am telling you this," he said, "because I have been in this house for 14 hours, and I have heard two versions of what is happening to it. One is Cornelius Trent's version, which is organized and convincing, and involves you being incapable of managing what your father left you. The other is yours, which is smaller and less organized, but which has evidence, and a ledger, and a footman who is afraid of what he knows, and a woman in a servant's dress at 5 in the morning who is not afraid of any of it." He looked at her directly. His gray eyes with their downward corners were not careful in this moment. They were simply open. "I am listening to you, Miss Fairweather. Tell me what you need." There are moments in a life when someone asks exactly the right question, and you understand, in the asking, that you have been waiting for it without knowing you were waiting. Dorothy's hands, which had been folded in her lap under the table, opened. She told him. She told him about Pemberton and the missing pages. She told him about the Carter at Darley Ford and the 4 pieces of silver. She told him about the bundled letters from the solicitor's chest and the field lease she could not find. She told him about the morning room door and what she had heard through it on the 2nd of January. She told him about the servant's dress and Mrs. Price, and the fact that a plain gray-brown dress and a white linen cap had made her invisible in her own house, which was both the practical advantage of the plan and the most clarifying thing she had learned about her situation in 6 months. He listened. He asked 3 questions, all of them specific and useful. He did not once tell her she was mistaken or that there might be another explanation. When she had finished, the candles had burned a 1/4 inch shorter and the fire had settled into red coals. He sat back and looked at the ledger. "The solicitor is due on Monday to oversee the transfer of the document chest to Cornelius for what Pemberton is calling safekeeping," he said. "If the relevant pages are in that chest and leave this house, proving what has been removed becomes significantly more difficult." "Yes," she said. "Then we have until Monday." He did not say "we" as though it required explanation. He said it the way one says a plainly established fact. "Are there any remaining items in the house that appear on your father's ledger, but are not currently where the ledger places them?" She opened to the 3rd page. He leaned forward, and his shoulder was close to hers, and the candle between them threw a shadow at the angle of his jaw that made the scar there very clear, and she was aware of him with the particular attentiveness the body reserves for things it is not yet allowed to name. "Here," she said, "and here." He nodded. He did not move away. She did not look up. If you have followed her this far, if you have stayed through the kitchen passage and the gray March morning and the dinner where nobody laughed, leave a word in the quiet if you can. She does not know yet what is coming, and neither does he, and there is something in that not yet knowing that is almost as good as the thing itself. She was in the morning room on Saturday, 3 days before Monday, making her own inventory of the writing table, when she heard Lady Cecily's voice in the passage. She was not meant to hear it. The door was not quite closed. The voices were low, but the passage was stone and carried sound the way all stone passages do, faithfully and without sentiment. She was going among the servants in disguise, Lady Cecily was saying, questioning them about what had been taken. Pemberton told Cornelius. Cornelius is furious. A pause. "I do feel for her, in a general way. It is a very difficult situation. One must acknowledge that a girl with ideas above her station will always find some manner of outstretching herself. It is simply what they do." Dorothy stood in the morning room with her hand on the writing table and her inventory list in her other hand, and heard what she had heard. It was not cruelty from Lady Cecily. Dorothy understood that, the way one understands the shape of a thing without wanting it. Lady Cecily was repeating something she had been told, in the particular tone of someone who has been given a version of events and found it credible because it fit the world she already knew. She was not trying to wound. She was simply occupying the position the world had built for her, which was a position that came with every advantage, and therefore the comfort of never having to question whether one's positions were accurate. None of this made the words sit any lighter in the room. Dorothy set her inventory list down on the writing table. She put her finger on the last entry she had made, which was a notation about the silver inkstand her father had kept by the window, present in the ledger and absent from the table. She stood with her finger on that entry for a moment. Then she folded the list and put it in her bodice against the green ribbon and went to find her coat. Pemberton knew. That was the essential fact, the one that organized everything else. If Pemberton knew she had been in the servants' quarters questioning the staff about what had been removed, he would not wait until Monday for the document chest. The timeline she and Ashbourne had been working within had just compressed, and she needed to know by how much. She went through the hall and the boot room and out through the side door into the yard. The cold was sharp after the morning room warmth. She pulled her coat closed. The stable yard was empty, the cobblestones wet from a morning thaw. She stood for a moment and listened to the sounds of the house settling around her. The distant rattle from the kitchen and a window pushed open on an upper floor and a horse moving in the far loose box. She was, she noted, not frightened. She had been frightened in November, and in December, and in January, when the missing items had accumulated and Pemberton's patients had pressed in on her from every direction and she had not yet known what to do. She was not frightened now. She was something more useful, which was certain. She found Ashbourne in the hall, returning from the stables. He had mud on his boots, and his dark hair was disordered from the cold, and he took one look at her face and said, "What has happened?" Not a question. A recognition. She told him. He was quiet for 3 seconds. "Come with me," he said. The dinner that evening was the last occasion before Monday on which Cornelius could gather enough witnesses to make his position unassailable, and he knew it, and he used it. The Calders were there, and the Mallows, and 2 solicitors from Buxton whom Pemberton had added to the evening at the last possible hour with an air of innocent necessity. Cornelius was in good humor throughout the meal, the particular humor of a man who has already made the decision and is enjoying the dinner that precedes its enactment. It was over dessert that he leaned back and looked at Dorothy across the table with the expression of a man performing reluctance very badly. "I am afraid," he said, "that I must raise a delicate matter. I had hoped to deal with it privately. Unfortunately, Miss Fairweather's recent behavior has made that impossible." He looked around the table. He had the attention of everyone at it. "It has come to my attention that my cousin has spent the past week impersonating a servant in her own household, questioning the staff on matters that ought to be the purview of the solicitor, and generally conducting herself in a manner that I think we must all agree raises serious questions about her fitness to manage her father's estate." The room was very still. Pemberton, at Cornelius's right hand, looked at the table. "I shall be frank," Cornelius continued. "A girl with ideas above her station is, as I have said before, a pretty thing in a daughter, and a costly one in an heir. My father's cousin left this house to Dorothy with the best of intentions. Intention, however, is not capacity. I am prepared to take the management of Chalcot House into my own hands with great care, and with every attention to Dorothy's comfort, as her family." He sat back and smiled at the table with the settled satisfaction of a man who has rehearsed this. Dorothy looked at her hands in her lap. She thought of her father's handwriting on the pages of the ledger. small and precise. She thought of the 1st of October and the cream jug and the apostle spoons. She thought of Thomas Whitmore with the gap between his teeth, pulling at his cuffs by the coal bucket, and of Mrs. Price fitting the linen cap over her dark hair with both hands as though dressing a child. She thought of Ashbourne in the library with the candle between them, saying, "I am listening to you." She thought of her father's kitchen passage, which she had known since she was 4 years old. She looked up. She looked at Cornelius. "Yes," she said quietly. "I impersonated a servant in my own house. I did it because it was the only available method by which I could gather evidence of what was being stolen from it." She looked at Pemberton. "The 14th of February. A carter named Daw. Darley Ford coaching in. 4 pieces of silver wrapped in Hessian cloth. Removed from this house on your instruction." Pemberton's face did something interesting. "I have my father's household ledger," Dorothy continued. "He kept it himself, in his own hand, since 1798. Every item of value in this house is catalogued and dated. Every item that has disappeared since November can be cross-referenced with that ledger and with the accounts pages that have been removed from the solicitor's chest, which means that the absence of those pages is itself evidence of what was recorded on them." She set her hands flat on the table. "I am prepared to present this to any person of authority in this room. I am also prepared to produce Thomas Whitmore, who carried the Hessian package to Dawes' cart at Cornelius's instruction, and who has given me his account in full." The room was entirely silent. Cornelius said, "This is," and stopped, because he had begun the sentence without knowing how it ended. "Preposterous," Pemberton offered. "Perhaps," said Ashbourne. He had not spoken before that moment. He had sat at the end of the table throughout the dinner with his gray eyes moving quietly around the room, and his voice, when it came, was the voice she had heard in the morning room when he said, "I am telling you this," and in the library when he said, "We have until Monday," and in the hall with mud on his boots when he said, "What has happened." It was level. It was precise. It had a quality of absolute certainty that did not raise itself to prove anything. "I had occasion to review Miss Fairweather's father's ledger 2 evenings ago," Ashbourne said. "I found it exact and complete. I also had occasion to speak with Thomas Whitmore this morning, before the household was awake, and to take down his account in writing, which I have here." He produced a folded paper from his coat pocket and set it on the table. "I have also sent a man to Darley Ford." The carter Daw confirmed the commission and the date in exchange for a conversation he found sufficiently persuasive. Another folded paper joined the first. "What Miss Fairweather has told this table is entirely consistent with the evidence currently in this room." He looked at Cornelius. Cornelius was looking at the 2 folded papers on the table with the expression of a man watching the floor of a room he was sure was solid begin to settle. "Miss Fairweather caught the thief," Ashbourne said. "I intend to marry her." The words had a quality of plainness that left no room for the room to misunderstand them. He was not performing anything. He was not deploying words as weapons. He was making a statement of fact in the particular register of a man who does not say things he does not mean, and whose not meaning things is so well established among those who know him that what he does mean arrives with the weight of something settled. Lady Cecily Mallow looked at her plate. She had a small, composed expression that could have meant several things, and Dorothy, watching her, thought that it meant I had wondered if he would. And now I know. There was something almost relieved in it. Pemberton pushed back his chair. He said something about the lateness of the hour. One of the Buxton solicitors had gone rather pale and was looking at his colleague with the specific look of a man recalculating the nature of the appointment he had agreed to attend. Cornelius said nothing else for the remainder of the evening. He sat with his hands on the table and his florid face at a new color that was neither anger nor embarrassment, but something beneath both, the particular face of a man whose argument has simply been removed from under him. The room resolved itself, as rooms do, into the ordinary motions of an evening concluding. People rose. People spoke to their neighbors. The fire settled in the grate. Mrs. Price appeared at the drawing-room door, looked at Dorothy across the room with a look that required no translation, and withdrew. Ashbourne moved toward Dorothy through the thinning company with the unhurried directness of a man who no longer has any reason to be deniable about anything, and when he reached her, he stood close and said, quietly, so that only she could hear, "I should have asked you first." She looked up at him, at the gray eyes with their downward corners, at the scar along the jaw, at the face that had been in the habit of listening, she thought, long before she had given it anything to listen to. "I would have said yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Something moved in his expression that she had not seen there before. Not the careful attention, not the precise consideration, but something less organized than those things. Something that reminded her of the candles in the library burning a quarter-inch shorter while she told him everything she knew. He took her hand. He did not kiss it. He simply held it for a moment in both of his, and his hands were warm. And outside the drawing-room windows, the Derbyshire moors were dark and still. The Buxton solicitors were gone by 10 o'clock. Pemberton followed an hour later, in circumstances that Mrs. Price described to the kitchen staff the next morning, with a brevity and precision that did the occasion full justice. Cornelius Trent remained at Chalcot for one further night, by which point the relevant professional authorities in the matter of the estate's document chest had been contacted and a preliminary review of the accounts had been arranged. And there was very little left for Cornelius to do except conclude his visit. He left on Sunday afternoon. He did not say goodbye to Dorothy. She did not require him to. Lady Cecily Mallow, in the moment before her carriage departed, came to Dorothy in the front hall and stood with her hands folded and said, "I am glad it came right," in a voice that was entirely sincere, and Dorothy, looking at her, thought that Lady Cecily had perhaps always known that Cornelius's version of events had a seam in it and had simply never been given the ledger. "Thank you," Dorothy said, and meant it. The kitchen at Chalcot House on a Monday morning in March had a smell that Dorothy had known her entire life. Coal and bread and the cold stone of the passage and the particular quality of Derbyshire air that came in when someone opened the yard door. Bessie the scullery girl had the fire at full heat by 5:30. The coal scuttle sat by the hearth where Dorothy had last set it down. The servant's dress was folded on the chair by the back door. Mrs. Price had laundered and pressed it, and returned it to the linen press, then taken it out again, and set it on the chair, and had not said why, and did not need to. Dorothy stood at the kitchen table with her father's ledger open in front of her. She had been going through it page by page since 6 o'clock, cross-referencing what remained with what had been taken and what had been recovered, making her own notations in a column alongside her father's, in a hand that was not as small as his, and not as precise, but was recognizably hers, and recognizably his, at the same time. She worked in the warm and the quiet with Bessie, moving at the edges of the room and the fire talking to itself behind the grate. She heard the yard door lift and push at 7 o'clock exactly. Ashbourne came in from the cold with his coat damp at the shoulders and mud on his boots again, and the look of a man who had been outside since before first light, managing something practical, and had not considered that this was unusual. He stopped when he saw her, and then he came to the table and looked at what she was doing without speaking for a moment. "You found the apothecary entry," he said. "My father's hand is very clear about dates." She showed him the page. He leaned over her shoulder to look, and she could feel the cold that had come in with him slowly releasing from his coat into the kitchen's warmth. "The cream jug is recoverable," he said. "I have a man at Darley Ford who is currently making Dawes' life fairly eventful. The apostle spoons are less likely." She turned a page. "My mother's cup I should like back, if it can be managed." "It will be managed," he said. She believed him. She was, she thought, beginning to understand that this was simply what he was. A man who said what he meant, and then did it. With the same quiet economy that had been in his hands when he caught the coal scuttle in the yard at 5:30 on a Wednesday morning, before he had any particular reason to catch it. She looked up at him over her shoulder. He was still reading the ledger. The kitchen light was the gray gold of a Derbyshire morning not yet decided about the sun, and it fell across the high, narrow forehead and the gray eyes and the scar at the jaw with the same indifference it fell across everything else, and she thought that her father would have liked him. Her father had always respected people who kept exact accounts. "My father updated this every quarter," she said. "I intend to continue." "I would expect nothing less," Ashbourne said. She turned back to the page. He did not move away. The fire spoke. Bessie crossed the kitchen with a bread pan and returned. Outside, the moors were lifting into the first pale light, the snow still on the high ground where winter had not yet finished its tenure, and the stone of Chalcot House was the stone it had always been, gray and particular and entirely unmoved by the events that had transpired within it. On the chair by the back door, the servant's dress lay folded and pressed and clean, the white apron on top of it, the linen cap placed with its brim facing out. It did not look like a disguise from this angle. It looked like what it was, a plain thing that had been used with courage and put carefully away. Dorothy Fairweather turned another page in her father's ledger and kept her accounts. Ashbourne's hand came to rest on the edge of the table beside hers, not touching, not quite, but present in the way that things which are decided are present, quietly and without requiring announcement. The kitchen was warm. The bread was rising. The spring would come, as it always came, up the Derbyshire lanes in its own time and without asking permission. If her story moved you, leave a word in the comments, and thank you, truly, for staying until the end.